Imagine, it's midnight. The house is silent, except for the steady patter of rain against the windows and the occasional low rumble of thunder that seems to roll through the walls. I sit alone, wrapped in the kind of stillness that makes every sound seem sharper, every shadow darker. Outside, rainwater streams down, pooling into small rivers along the edges of the yard. The air feels heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and wood, as if the entire house has absorbed the storm's chill. Before I go deeper into the story, welcome, and make sure to subscribe to the channel, Echoes of Nightmares, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on any of the future scary tales. If you're enjoying this story, hit that like button too. Now back to my story. A dim light flickers overhead, a bulb that's been needing to be changed for days, but somehow I keep forgetting. It casts weak, trembling shadows across the hallway, barely illuminating the staircase that leads down into the basement. That basement, the one place in the house I never linger near. Just thinking about it sends an uneasy shiver down my spine, like an instinct telling me to stay away, to ignore whatever might be hiding in the dark. But then, just as my eyes start to drift closed, lulled by the rhythm of the rain, I hear it. A soft, barely there sound. Something scraping faintly from below. My heart skips a beat, and I sit frozen, listening, waiting, unsure if my mind is playing tricks on me. Then it comes again, a shuffling sound, something moving down there in the silence of the basement. I want to tell myself it's nothing. A trick of the wind, maybe, or the house settling, shifting under the weight of the storm. But deep down, I know better. I know that sound, and it's coming from a place where there shouldn't be anyone or anything moving around. So I sit there listening, my mind racing. I can feel my pulse quickening, each beat loud and heavy in my ears, and that familiar sense of dread creeping up my spine. My eyes are fixed on the basement door, half expecting it to swing open at any moment, revealing what? I don't know. I can only imagine. What would you do? Go down to investigate, hoping to find nothing, or pretend you heard nothing at all? I'd only moved into the house a few weeks ago. It was an old place, inherited from a distant relative I'd barely known. I hadn't planned on living here, but after a string of circumstances, there I was alone in this creaking, empty house. It was a strange sensation, living in a place filled with someone else's memories, their belongings, their secrets. And this house had secrets. From the moment I'd stepped inside, it felt off. The kind of feeling you can't explain, like an itch in the back of your mind, a whisper that something isn't quite right. The basement was the worst part. Unfinished, damp, and cold, it stretched out beneath the house like a forgotten maze. The ceiling was low, crisscrossed with old, exposed beams and pipes that dripped periodically, staining the concrete floor with little pools of water. Dim, bare bulbs hung from the ceiling, casting thin patches of light that never seemed to reach the far corners. Shadows clung to those corners, thick and impenetrable, as if the light was swallowed whole before it could illuminate whatever was lurking there. Down there, I found things that should have been thrown out years ago. A stack of broken chairs, boxes piled high with faded clothes, a collection of dusty, worn books with pages that cracked when I opened them. And there were stranger things too. Small, unsettling items left behind like remnants of another life. A child's shoe, worn down to the sole. A porcelain doll, its face cracked, one glass eye missing, staring blankly up at me from under a sheet of dust. A tarnished mirror, its glass smudged and speckled with age. None of it made sense. It felt as if someone had left these things intentionally, like breadcrumbs, little reminders of someone or something that had once been here. Each time I went down there, it felt like the basement was watching me. It sounds ridiculous, I know, but that's the only way I can describe it. I'd feel this strange, prickling sensation, like 1,000 invisible eyes were following my every move. I'd stand still, listening, straining to hear something beyond my own breathing, beyond the occasional drip of water. And sometimes, just sometimes, there'd be something else. A faint noise, too soft to identify, just at the edge of hearing, like a sigh or a whisper coming from somewhere deep within those shadows. I told myself it was my imagination. I was alone in an unfamiliar house, jumping at shadows. But then, as the days passed, the noises grew more frequent. At first, they came only at night. A faint scratching, like nails dragging slowly across wood, or a muffled thud, like something falling to the floor. Then, they started during the day. I'd be upstairs, in the kitchen or the hallway, and suddenly I'd hear it, a soft shuffling sound from below. My heart would start to race, my ears straining to catch every detail, every shift in the silence. It was like the house was trying to get my attention, calling me down into that darkness, daring me to look deeper, to find whatever was making those sounds. And I tried to ignore it. Really, I did. But each day, that feeling of unease grew stronger, gnawing at the back of my mind. It was like the basement was alive, a silent, watchful presence lurking just out of sight. I'd find myself avoiding it, taking longer routes around the house just to avoid the door, leaving lights on as if that might somehow keep the shadows at bay. But the noises, they never stopped. And each time I heard them, I'd feel that same cold, prickling fear, that same dreadful certainty that something was down there, watching, waiting. And it was only a matter of time before I'd have to face it. The noises grew bolder as the days went on, scratching, faint at first, like something small was scrabbling against the concrete floor, then louder, heavier, a scraping sound that seemed to echo up the stairs, reverberating through the wooden beams and making the hairs on my arms stand on end. Sometimes it was a dull thud, as though something had shifted or fallen, but each time I went down to investigate, everything was exactly as I'd left it, or so I thought. Then, one afternoon, I noticed something strange. A stack of boxes that had been tucked into the corner now lay strewn across the floor, their contents spilling out. Old yellowed papers, a chipped tea set, and a small, rusted tin that looked as if it hadn't been opened in decades. I crouched down, staring at the tin, reaching out, almost compelled to open it. But something stopped me. I could feel a heaviness in the air, a tension that seemed to press against me, warning me to leave it alone. Slowly, I backed away, the box lying open, its secrets spilling out, yet untouched. But the more I searched, the more unsettling discoveries I made. On the far wall, barely visible under years of grime and dust, I found strange symbols scrawled in faded paint or chalk, winding across the wall in chaotic patterns. They looked old, worn down, as though someone had once drawn them frantically, urgently, and then left them to fade into the shadows. I reached out, my fingers hovering over one of the symbols, feeling the faint grooves in the concrete. The moment my fingertips brushed against it, a chill ran through me, a deep, bone-cold dread that made me recoil, pulling my hand back instinctively. And then there was the air itself, thick and stale, like the very walls were breathing, exhaling something damp and dark. It felt oppressive, heavy with an age and weight that didn't belong to any basement I'd ever known. Every step I took seemed to echo, amplified by the silence, as if each creak, each shuffle, was being recorded, memorized by something unseen. As I moved around, I could feel it, something following me, invisible but present, a shadow lurking just out of sight, watching my every move. Then came that night. It was late, and I was in bed, finally dozing off to the sound of rain pattering on the windows, the faint rustle of leaves brushing against the house. Then a sharp, distinct noise snapped me awake, a scratching, long and slow, from somewhere below. My heart pounded in my chest as I lay there, listening, barely daring to breathe. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, moving up the walls, through the floorboards, as though something was trying to claw its way out. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I knew I had to see what was happening down there. The stairs creaked under my feet as I made my way down, flashlight trembling in my hand, illuminating the narrow path ahead. I could feel my pulse thudding in my ears, each step growing heavier, the sense of dread wrapping around me like a thick fog. Reaching the bottom, I swept the light across the room, catching the faint glint of dust particles hanging in the still air. I could barely breathe, each breath shallow and tight, as if the basement itself was closing in around me. That's when I noticed something I hadn't seen before. At the far end of the basement, hidden behind a stack of old furniture and covered in layers of dust, there was a door. It was almost invisible, blending into the shadows, as though it had been purposely hidden away. The wood was dark and warped, almost as if it had absorbed the years of dampness and darkness, molding itself into the wall. My flashlight flickered, casting fleeting shadows across its surface, and I could see deep scratches etched into the wood around the edges, as though someone had tried to claw their way out. The door was sealed shut, no visible handle or latch, and the sight of it sent a cold rush through me, a primal fear that I couldn't shake. I reached out, fingers hovering just inches from the wood, feeling a strange warmth radiating from it, almost like a heartbeat, a faint, pulsing energy that seemed to breathe beneath my touch. I backed away, my mind racing with questions. Who had hidden this door, and what was behind it? Why were there scratches, and why did it seem like something was still waiting there, just beyond that thin barrier of wood? I stood there, staring at the door, every instinct screaming at me to leave, to run, to get out of that basement. And yet, I couldn't pull myself away. After that night, things began to change. The house felt different, heavier, as if that strange, hidden door had stirred something awake. It started with little things at first, small annoyances that could easily be explained away. Doors I closed firmly would be open when I turned around, swinging slightly, as if pushed by a phantom breeze. Lights would flicker, sometimes for a few seconds, casting erratic shadows that seemed to shift and pulse, stretching across the walls as if they had a life of their own. I told myself it was the wiring, that it was an old house with quirks and flaws, and these were nothing more than the natural groans and creaks of a place long uninhabited. But deep down, I knew better. There was an unnatural chill in the air, one that settled around me, pressing against my skin and filling my lungs with each breath. It was like the house was alive, aware, watching, and whatever I'd uncovered in that basement, it wasn't content to stay hidden. Then the dreams began. Every night, I'd drift off to sleep, only to find myself back in the basement, standing alone in the dark. In these dreams, the walls seemed to close in, the shadows thicker, darker, creeping along the edges of my vision. And always, at the far end of the room, that hidden door loomed, barely visible through the haze, its dark wood scratched and worn, seeming to pulse with a faint, eerie glow. In one dream, I approached the door, feeling that same dreadful pull, an instinct to open it, to see what lay beyond. My hand would reach out, fingers brushing against the warm, breathing wood, and then I'd wake up, drenched in sweat, heart racing, the echo of a whisper lingering in my ears, something just on the edge of understanding, a voice calling me, drawing me back down into that basement. Each time, it felt more real, as if the dream were just an extension of something waiting for me in the waking world. Then, as if the dreams weren't enough, I began finding objects that didn't belong to me. It started one morning, as I was tidying up. There, lying in the middle of the living room floor, was a small, dusty doll. Its face was cracked, porcelain skin chipped, with one eye missing, staring up at me in a way that felt unnervingly alive. I picked it up, feeling the weight of it in my hands, the roughness of the dust clinging to my fingers. I had never seen this doll before, yet there it was, as though it had been left for me to find, a strange relic from some forgotten past. The discoveries didn't stop there. A few days later, I found a small locket resting on the windowsill, tarnished and worn, the metal scratched and dull. When I opened it, I found no picture inside, just an empty frame, as though whoever had worn it had left it behind in a hurry, abandoning whatever memories it held. Each object felt significant, as if it carried a story, a past that I was being drawn into against my will. The house was showing me pieces of itself, fragments of lives that had passed through it, and I couldn't shake the feeling that these weren't just coincidences. They were warnings. I'd lie awake at night, the silence around me thick and suffocating, straining to hear any sound that might betray whatever presence was lurking in the shadows. And then, one night, as I lay there in the dark, I heard it, a voice, soft and low, drifting up from the basement. It was faint, almost a whisper, but unmistakable. It called my name, drawn out in a tone that was both familiar and foreign, as if the house itself had learned it, twisting it into something unrecognizable. A chill ran through me, freezing me in place as I listened, heart pounding, every instinct telling me to stay put, to ignore it, to pretend I hadn't heard. But the voice persisted, repeating my name over and over, each time sounding closer, more insistent, as if something was beckoning me, urging me to come down and face it. Have you ever felt that eerie sensation, that strange sense of being called, even though you're alone? Have you ever heard something that shouldn't be there, something that leaves you questioning your own mind? I lay there, paralyzed by fear, the voice calling to me from the basement, each syllable thick with a dark, sinister familiarity. It felt like a dream, but this was real. This was happening, and as much as I wanted to turn away, to cover my ears and pretend it was nothing, I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. The next morning, I knew I couldn't keep pretending. Whatever was happening in that house, in that basement, wasn't going to just go away. The voice from the night before still echoed in my mind, haunting and clear, and I felt that I was teetering on the edge of something unknown and dangerous. It was time to find out what I could about the place. I drove to the town library, hoping that maybe, in the archives, I'd find some clue. I didn't have much to go on, just my gnawing curiosity and the oppressive sense of dread that had woven itself into my days and nights. But the librarian, an elderly woman with keen eyes, seemed to know exactly what I was looking for. When I mentioned the address, she stiffened, her gaze narrowing as though she were seeing something long buried. "You don't know, do you?" she whispered, glancing around as though she expected someone, or something, to be listening. "That house, it's been empty for years, and for good reason." She led me to a dusty section of the archives, pulling out a handful of yellowed newspapers and brittle documents, all bearing the address of my house. As I flipped through the pages, a dark history began to unfold. Headlines leapt out at me, each one adding another layer of horror to the story. Local man vanishes without a trace. Residents flee after strange sightings in the basement. Woman claims she hears voices in the night. There were photographs, too, black and white images that had faded over the years but still held a haunting clarity. One picture showed the house as it had been decades ago, looking almost identical to how it stood today, as if time had barely touched it. Another photo showed a family, standing together in front of the house, a man, a woman, and a young child. They looked happy, but there was a shadow in the corner of the picture, a faint smudge that seemed to loom over them, almost like a figure that had been caught by accident, standing at the edge of their lives. I kept reading, each article revealing more unsettling details about the previous residents. The family in the photo, the Lockwoods, had moved in years ago, hoping for a fresh start, but they didn't stay long. According to the reports, they complained of strange occurrences almost immediately after moving in. Objects disappearing, footsteps echoing through empty rooms, and a sense of being watched. The final article was chilling. Local man goes missing. Wife claims he entered the basement and never returned. The article described the last night anyone had seen Mr. Lockwood. He'd gone down into the basement after hearing strange noises, telling his wife he'd check it out. She'd waited, listening, hearing him call out a few times, his voice growing softer, fading away, and then nothing. She'd waited for hours, calling his name, but he never came back up. They searched the basement, the house, the woods nearby, but he was never seen again. Some said he'd run off, but his wife insisted, right up until her own death, that something had taken him. Something in the house. I felt a shiver run through me as I stared at the photo of the Lockwoods, their faces faded and ghostly, trapped in that moment of false peace before everything had gone wrong. Suddenly, everything made a twisted kind of sense. The strange symbols, the hidden door, the voices that had started calling out to me. I was living in a place that had claimed lives before, and it wasn't done yet. I sat there, the weight of the house's dark history pressing down on me, and for a moment, I considered leaving, just walking away, never looking back, letting the house keep its secrets. But something kept me there, a grim, morbid curiosity, perhaps, or the feeling that whatever haunted that place wouldn't let me go so easily. I could feel its pull, that quiet, insistent whisper urging me to dig deeper, to uncover what lay hidden in the basement shadows. What would you do if you were in my shoes? Would you keep investigating, pushing forward despite the danger? Or would you leave, abandoning the mystery and hoping it would fade into memory? I knew, deep down, that I couldn't turn back now. The house had chosen me, drawing me into its web, and there was no escape. There was no turning back now. Armed with a flashlight and a desperate, reckless determination, I descended into the basement once more. Every step felt heavier than the last, the air thickening as if the very walls were closing in on me, urging me to stop, to turn around. But the pull of that hidden door was stronger. It was as if something beyond the walls, beyond my understanding, was summoning me, demanding that I uncover whatever was concealed in that forsaken corner. The door itself stood in front of me, ominous and silent, its wooden frame warped and cracked with age. I felt a hesitation, a warning creeping up my spine, but I pushed it aside. I was past the point of retreat. With a crowbar clutched tightly in my hands, I forced the door open, the wood splintering with a loud crack that echoed through the basement, mingling with the pounding of the rain outside. It felt like the house itself was protesting, as though I were tearing open an old wound that had never truly healed. As the door gave way, a wave of cold, damp air rushed out, carrying with it the scent of decay and something else, a faint, metallic tang that lingered at the back of my throat. I took a hesitant step forward, feeling the weight of the darkness pressing against me, thick and suffocating. My flashlight beam cut through the blackness, illuminating symbols on the walls, etched deep into the stone, twisting and winding like a language from another time, another world. Each symbol felt wrong, almost alive, pulsating in the dim light, as if they were watching me, marking my every move. I could barely breathe. The room beyond the door was small, cramped, the walls pressing in from all sides. There were no windows, no vents, just the unyielding stone walls and the damp, cold air that clung to my skin. Scattered across the floor were remnants of a life long abandoned. Old, faded drawings, cracked and yellowed with age, lay strewn about, depicting twisted figures and dark shapes, scenes that seemed almost impossible, filled with shadows and terror. It was as if whoever had drawn them had seen things no one else had, glimpses of nightmares that had bled onto the paper, immortalizing their fear. And there, in the corner of the room, was a small, makeshift altar. The remnants of an old ritual lay scattered across its surface. Candles burnt down to mere stubs. The wax melted into strange, erratic shapes. Pieces of cloth, torn and stained with something dark, and a small mirror, its surface clouded and cracked, reflecting only fragments of the darkness around me. It was clear that something unholy, something dangerous had been invoked here, summoned from depths best left unexplored. I took a step closer, compelled by an inexplicable urge to touch, to understand. My hand reached out, fingers trembling as they brushed against the surface of the altar, and in that moment, I felt it, a faint, almost imperceptible brush of something cold and soft, something that shouldn't have been there. It was as if a hand, unseen and unfathomable, had reached out to greet me, welcoming me into its dark embrace. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, every nerve in my body screaming in alarm. I spun around, the flashlight flickering as I desperately scanned the room, but there was nothing, no one. Yet the feeling remained, lingering in the air, pressing down on me, the unmistakable sensation that I was no longer alone in that room. I took a step back, heart pounding, breath shallow and quick, and for the first time since entering, I felt true fear, a primal, consuming terror that told me to run, to escape before whatever lurked in the shadows revealed itself. But the door behind me had swung shut, sealing me in, trapping me in that tiny, suffocating room, surrounded by symbols of fear and remnants of rituals that whispered of things beyond human comprehension. Would you have the courage to keep looking, to stay in that darkness, knowing something else is there, watching, waiting? Or would you turn back, leave it all behind, knowing some doors should never be opened? In that confined, airless room, I felt the weight of the darkness bearing down on me like never before. The silence was almost suffocating, broken only by the distant rumble of thunder and the occasional drip of water echoing somewhere unseen. But as I stood there, frozen, something else began to emerge, a presence, shifting in the corner of my vision, in the very edges of the flashlight beam. My breath caught, and I held perfectly still, my pulse hammering in my chest as I forced myself to look. At first, I told myself it was only shadows, tricks of the light. But the shadows didn't stay still. They moved slowly, deliberately, coalescing into shapes that were almost, but not quite, human. They seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with a faint, unnatural rhythm, like something alive yet not of this world. A chill settled over me, an icy dread that seeped into my bones, rooting me to the spot as I watched the figures shift and twist, drawing closer with each heartbeat. And then I felt it, a cold, almost skeletal hand pressing down on my shoulder. It was light at first, as if testing me, but then it tightened, its grip strengthening, pulling me back toward the center of the room. My flashlight flickered, casting jagged shadows that danced along the walls, distorting the symbols, twisting them into even darker shapes. I couldn't breathe, my heart racing as I felt a second presence closing in, the sound of shallow, rasping breaths filling the space around me, each exhale brushing against the back of my neck. A voice, a low, guttural whisper, rose up beside my ear, faint but unmistakable, carrying with it words I couldn't understand, syllables that grated against my mind, unearthly, incomprehensible. The words were ancient, filled with menace, a language that belonged to something older and far darker than anything I could comprehend. They seemed to pulse in the air, each phrase twisting deeper into my mind, clawing at my sanity, as if trying to pull me into whatever dark realm these shadows had come from. I couldn't stand it any longer. Panic surged through me, raw and all-consuming. I spun around, wrenching myself free from the grip of that icy hand, my flashlight dropping to the floor and casting wild, chaotic beams of light across the room as I stumbled toward the door. My heart thundered in my chest, each step heavy, desperate, as if the very air were dragging me back, holding me captive. I bolted up the stairs, the door ahead looming like a beacon, the one escape from the horrors below. But with every step I took, I felt it, an unrelenting presence following, a dark weight pressing closer, filling the space behind me, as though the very shadows were alive, chasing me, clawing at my back, trying to drag me back into the depths. The whispers grew louder, echoing off the stone walls, a cacophony of voices all around me, filling my mind, pressing in until it felt like my head would burst. I could hear footsteps, heavy and deliberate, right behind me, each one echoing with a sense of finality, as though something inescapable was closing in. I reached the top of the stairs, my hand fumbling for the door handle, feeling that cold, creeping dread engulf me, tightening around my chest. Just as my fingers closed around the handle, I felt it, a hand on my ankle, gripping tightly, pulling me back, dragging me toward the darkness below. With a desperate, panicked cry, I wrenched myself free, stumbling into the hallway as the door slammed shut behind me, sealing the horrors below. I scrambled back, heart pounding, gasping for air, the whispers still echoing in my mind, haunting, relentless, as though they had followed me, attaching themselves to my very soul. I was out of the basement, but the house still felt wrong, twisted, like it had somehow changed, like it was alive and watching me, waiting. I wasn't safe. I knew that now. Whatever was in that basement, it wasn't done with me. The days that followed my frantic escape from the basement felt like an eternity, stretching endlessly before me. I threw myself into boarding up that cursed door, sealing it with every piece of scrapwood I could find. The loud thuds of nails piercing through the wooden planks felt like a form of exorcism, a desperate attempt to protect myself from whatever darkness lay behind that door. With each nail driven home, I felt a mix of relief and fear, a relief in knowing that I had taken a step to protect myself, but an ever-deepening fear that I had merely postponed the inevitable. Once the door was securely sealed, the house settled into a tense silence, the kind of quiet that sits heavily in the air. I tried to convince myself that I was safe, that I had closed off the terror that had so nearly consumed me. But night after night, as darkness fell and shadows crept along the walls, I heard them, the faint sounds creeping from the basement. At first, they were just whispers, like the rustling of leaves outside, soft and fleeting. I would lie in bed, clutching the sheets, my heart racing as the whispers drifted up from beneath the floorboards, a chilling reminder of the horrors I had encountered. Then they grew louder, shifting into low thuds and scraping noises, like something clawing at the wood, trying to break free. The air grew heavy and thick each night, filled with an unshakable tension that settled into my bones. I tried to ignore it, tried to convince myself that I was imagining things, that the old house was simply settling, creaking like it always had. But deep down, I knew the truth. Something was down there, something that had awakened with my intrusion, and now it was restless, angry. I could feel it watching me, lurking just beyond the boarded-up door, waiting for the moment when I would slip up, when my courage would falter. Each night, I would lie in bed, paralyzed by fear, listening to the relentless sounds echoing through the darkness. Sometimes, I would catch myself staring at that door, my mind racing, trying to piece together the fragmented memories of what I had seen, the symbols, the altar, the shadows. I wondered if I had imagined it all, if my mind had simply conjured up the darkness as a way of coping with the isolation of the house. But the sounds were real, undeniable. They were a constant reminder that whatever had once occupied that space was still there, waiting for the chance to escape. Then came the night when the noises shifted again. This time, they morphed into a low, keening wail, an echo of the whispers that had once brushed past my ear. It filled the house, resonating through the walls, drowning out any thoughts of safety. I sat upright in bed, my heart pounding, a cold sweat slicking my skin as I listened, terrified and entranced. It sounded almost human, filled with pain and longing, a cry for help, or perhaps a cry of vengeance. In that moment, I felt a deep, chilling realization settle over me. I could board up the door, I could pretend I was safe, but I would never truly escape the terror that had rooted itself in my mind. It was inescapable. The darkness had already seeped into my life, into my very being. As the dawn finally broke, casting pale light through the dusty windows, I sat in silence, grappling with the uncertainty of it all. Had I unleashed something from the depths of that basement? Or had it always been there, waiting for a moment of vulnerability to strike? I felt as though I were caught in a web, a sinister game played by forces beyond my understanding, each thread pulling me back toward the darkness I had tried to escape. I resolved to stay, to confront whatever had taken root in the shadows of my home. But deep inside, I knew that I was only postponing the inevitable. The question lingered in the air, haunting me like the whispers from the basement. Would I ever truly be safe? Or was I destined to share my life with the malevolence that lurked just beyond the door? Now, as I sit here recounting this story, I turn to you, dear listener. Would you be able to stay in a house with something like that in the basement? Or would you leave for good? The choice is yours, but remember, sometimes the things we fear the most are the shadows lurking within our own minds. It was a stormy night when I first heard the whispers coming from the basement. Little did I know, the darkness below held secrets that would change everything. The rain lashed against the windows, an unrelenting torrent that made the night feel even more oppressive. The thunder rumbled in the distance, echoing through the empty rooms of my inherited house, and the wind howled as if it were warning me of what lay beneath. As I sat in the flickering candlelight, I felt an uneasy chill creep through the floorboards, as if the very house were breathing, alive with some unseen presence. The air was thick with a musty scent of dampness, a lingering odor that spoke of years of neglect and decay. Shadows danced along the walls, cast by the flickering flames, stretching and contorting into shapes that seemed to move of their own accord. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The whispers grew louder, a soft murmur that tickled the edge of my consciousness, pulling at my curiosity and fear alike. What would you do if you heard whispers calling your name from the dark? Would you investigate or ignore it? As I sat there, alone in that creaking house, I couldn't help but wonder if the answers lay hidden below, in the depths of that foreboding basement. My name is Alex, and I had just started a new chapter in my life. A college student with dreams of making it big. I found myself living alone in a family home that had been passed down from a distant relative I barely knew. It wasn't exactly the bustling city apartment I had envisioned, but it was mine, a place to escape the chaos of university life. The house, an old Victorian, stood proudly amidst a tangle of overgrown weeds and towering trees, their branches swaying like skeletal fingers in the wind. When I first moved in, I was charmed by the house's character, its high ceilings, intricate moldings, and wooden floors that creaked with every step. But as the days turned into nights, the charm faded, revealing a more unsettling atmosphere. It was as if the house had a life of its own, and I was merely a guest in its eerie embrace. The basement was the worst part. I had avoided it since the day I arrived. The door at the bottom of the stairs was heavy and old, and it creaked ominously whenever I touched the knob. I could see just enough through the small, grimy window to know it was filled with old furniture covered in sheets, boxes stacked haphazardly, and cobwebs draping like curtains from the ceiling. The strong, musty odor wafting up the stairs spoke of neglect, dust, and the dampness that seemed to seep through the very walls. Whenever I stood at the top of the stairs, I could feel a chill running down my spine, as if the basement were a dark pit that swallowed all light and warmth. Each time I glanced down into the abyss, I felt a nagging sensation that I was being watched. I dismissed it as my imagination, but the fleeting glimpses of shadows flickering just out of sight made it hard to shake the feeling. It was at night, when the house was wrapped in darkness and the wind howled outside, that the unease crept in the most. The air grew heavy, and I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle as if it were trying to whisper secrets to me. Each creak of the floorboard seemed magnified in the silence, and the distant rumble of thunder only added to the sense of foreboding. I had convinced myself that I was simply getting accustomed to my new surroundings, but deep down, I felt something was off. There were times I could almost swear I heard whispers echoing through the hallways, low and unintelligible, as if the house itself were trying to communicate. I would often brush it off as the wind or my imagination running wild, but there was always that lingering thought that perhaps there was something more beneath the surface. Each night, as I fought to sleep, I would glance toward the basement door, its dark presence looming just beyond the hallway. I knew I should explore it, confront whatever lay beneath, but the fear of what I might find kept me rooted in place. The whispers returned, more insistent now, echoing in my mind as I tried to sleep. It was as if they were calling me down, pulling at my curiosity, while simultaneously paralyzing me with dread. As the rain pounded against the windows, I couldn't help but wonder what lay behind that door. What was the truth lurking in the shadows of the basement? And would I ever find the courage to face it? The first time I heard the whispers, it was a night like any other. The rain lashed against the windows, the wind howled outside, and I was buried under a pile of textbooks, trying to study for an upcoming exam. I had just settled into a rhythm when the sound drifted up from the basement. A faint, scratching noise followed by a soft whisper that seemed to weave its way through the walls. My heart raced, and I froze, my pen hovering above the page. Just the house settling, I muttered to myself, but deep down, I knew it felt different. There was an urgency in the noise, a hint of something more. I tried to refocus on my studies, but the whispers persisted, rising and falling like a haunting melody that only I could hear. The scratching grew louder, echoing through the stillness, and with every passing moment, the air around me grew heavier, as if the house itself were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. After what felt like an eternity, I set down my book and forced myself to stand. The floor creaked beneath my feet as I approached the basement door, a portal to the unknown that filled me with dread. Each step felt like a weight pressing down on my chest, a primal instinct warning me to turn back. I hesitated, hand hovering over the doorknob, listening intently. The whispers had faded, replaced by a silence so thick it was suffocating. Gathering every ounce of courage, I turned the knob and opened the door. The air rushed up to greet me, cold and damp, wrapping around me like a shroud. I peered into the darkness below, the faint flicker of candlelight illuminating the first few steps. Shadows clung to the walls, and I could barely make out the outline of old furniture and stacks of boxes. The whispers had vanished, leaving only the sound of my own breathing in the stillness. As I descended the creaky steps, each one seemed to groan under my weight, echoing through the emptiness. The basement opened up before me, an unsettling space filled with relics of the past. Dust motes danced in the candlelight, swirling in the heavy air. I took a hesitant step further into the room, and that's when I noticed it, an old trunk sitting in the corner, half hidden beneath a tattered sheet. Curiosity piqued. I approached the trunk and brushed away the dust. As I lifted the lid, a cloud of stale air escaped, revealing a jumble of forgotten belongings. A cracked mirror, faded photographs, and a small, leather-bound journal. My heart raced as I lifted the journal from the trunk, its cover worn and frayed. Flipping through the pages, I was immediately struck by the frantic scrawl of the writing inside. The entries were filled with despair and fear, recounting encounters that mirrored my own, whispers, scratching sounds, and an overwhelming sense of being watched. Each page held a new revelation, detailing how the previous owner had become increasingly paranoid, convinced that something lurked in the darkness below. The final pages were nearly illegible, filled with a wild script that echoed the whispers I had heard, phrases repeating like a chant that seemed to beckon me deeper into the house's mysteries. I felt a chill run down my spine as I read the words, a creeping realization that whatever had haunted the previous occupant was still here, still waiting. I could hear the rain pounding outside, the storm intensifying, but all I could focus on was the weight of the journal in my hands. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to shut the trunk and block out the terror that lurked below, but an inexplicable pull urged me to continue, to uncover the truth. Then, without warning, a sharp scratching sound echoed from the far corner of the basement, slicing through my thoughts like a knife. My breath caught in my throat as I glanced up, heart pounding. Shadows shifted just beyond the range of my candlelight, and I felt a chill sweep through the room, wrapping around me like an icy embrace. I stood frozen, the journal slipping from my fingers and thudding to the ground, the sound drowning in the roar of the storm outside. The scratching noise grew louder, more insistent, as if whatever was in the shadows wanted to break free. My mind raced, battling the urge to run against an equally powerful need to confront whatever lay hidden in the darkness. But as the shadows danced at the edge of the light, I could feel a presence lingering just beyond my vision, and I was suddenly acutely aware of my vulnerability in that moment. Would I dare to step closer, or would I retreat into the safety of my room, leaving the basement, and whatever horror it held, behind me? The days that followed were marked by a growing unease, as the house began to reveal its unsettling nature. It started with small things, doors closing with a suddenness that made my heart race, even when I was sure I had left them open. I would be in my room, studying or watching TV, only to hear the unmistakable creak of the basement door slamming shut. Each time, I would glance over my shoulder, a shiver creeping down my spine as I remembered the whispers and scratching noises that haunted my nights. One evening, as I sat at my desk, a flicker of movement caught my eye. The overhead light began to strobe like a faulty bulb, casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls. I squinted into the dim light, half expecting to see something lurking in the corner, but there was only the flickering bulb and the oppressive silence of the house. I reached up to twist the switch, but before I could, the light stabilized, plunging the room into darkness. "Great," I muttered under my breath, fumbling for my phone to use as a flashlight. But when I reached for my bag, I noticed something off. My favorite jacket, which I had hung over the chair earlier that day, was now missing. I searched the room in a frenzy, pulling everything out of drawers and looking beneath my bed. Just as I was about to give up, a sudden instinct drove me to the basement. Heart pounding, I grabbed my phone and opened the door, the familiar dampness creeping up to greet me. I descended the steps cautiously, the beam of light cutting through the dark like a knife. The shadows seemed to swallow my light, but I pressed on, driven by a desperate hope to find my jacket. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, a chill enveloped me, and I scanned the room for any sign of my missing belongings. That's when I noticed it, a glimpse of fabric peeking out from behind an old, forgotten chair. I rushed over, my heart racing in anticipation. To my confusion, it wasn't my jacket at all. Instead, lying there in the dust, was a small wooden box. It was intricately carved, but the craftsmanship was faded and rough, as if it had been neglected for years. I opened the box, expecting to find trinkets or old photos, but instead, I was met with the hollow gaze of a cracked porcelain doll, its features warped and unsettling. The sight sent a wave of nausea through me, and I quickly shut the box, pushing it aside. Later that night, I tried to shake off the strange occurrences and climbed into bed, hoping to get some rest. But sleep evaded me, and my mind was clouded with images of the doll, the scratching sounds, and the ominous whispers. As I lay in the dark, I finally succumbed to sleep, but the dreams that awaited me were far from peaceful. In my dream, I found myself standing at the foot of the basement stairs, a familiar feeling of dread washing over me. The shadows seemed thicker, more alive than ever before. A figure stood at the top of the stairs, just out of reach, its outline shrouded in darkness. I could feel it watching me, a sensation that was both terrifying and oddly inviting. Then, I heard it, the soft, chilling whisper of my name, echoing through the air like a long-forgotten song. "Alex." I jolted awake, the echo of the whisper still ringing in my ears, a remnant of the haunting dream. I sat up in bed, breathing heavily, trying to convince myself it was just a nightmare. Yet the unease lingered like a heavy fog, refusing to dissipate. In the days that followed, the strange occurrences grew more unsettling. Items began to disappear from my room, only to reappear in the basement. I'd search for my keys only to find them sitting on the cold concrete floor down below, the sound of the whispers almost taunting me. Every time I braved the basement, I could feel the atmosphere shift, thickening as if something were waiting for me to make a mistake. One night, as I descended the stairs to retrieve my phone charger, I stumbled across something that made my blood run cold. There, sitting innocently at the top of the stairs, was a small teddy bear, a bright red bow adorning its neck, its button eyes glinting in the dim light. My stomach dropped as I stared at it, recognition flooding back to me. Just days before, I had tucked that same bear away in a box down in the basement, a remnant of my childhood that I had forgotten. "What the hell?" I breathed, my voice barely above a whisper. I had left it in the basement. I was certain of it. Tentatively, I reached for the bear, its fur soft but uncomfortably warm, as if it had been recently held. I glanced down the stairs into the darkness below, the whispers echoing in my mind, a cacophony of voices rising and falling in urgency. The sensation of being watched prickled at the back of my neck, and the weight of unseen eyes felt heavier than ever. As I stood frozen, grappling with confusion and fear, the power flickered again. Darkness washed over me, leaving me isolated in the black void. My heart pounded in my chest as I felt the chill creeping closer, shadows beginning to shift at the corners of my vision. I backed away from the stairs, instinctively clutching the teddy bear, feeling its fabric almost pulse in my grip. Suddenly, I felt a rush of air sweep past me, and I knew then that I wasn't alone in the house anymore. Days turned into weeks, and the strange occurrences continued to haunt me. I felt like a prisoner in my own home, constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for something to reach out from the shadows. One afternoon, seeking some semblance of normalcy, I decided to take a walk around the neighborhood. Maybe a bit of fresh air would clear my mind. As I strolled, I spotted an elderly neighbor sitting on her porch, her gaze distant, as she watched the rain-drenched street. Curiosity tugged at me, and I approached her, hoping for some light conversation to lift the heavy weight pressing on my chest. "Afternoon," I greeted, attempting to sound casual despite the dread that still clung to me. "Afternoon, dear," she replied, her voice frail but warm. "You're new in the old Johnson house, aren't you? Quite the place you've inherited." Her words struck me like a lightning bolt. "You know the house?" I asked, my heart racing at the thought of hearing anything related to its history. "Oh, yes," she nodded, her expression darkening. "It's a shame what happened there. A little boy lived there years ago. Jason, his name was. He went missing one stormy night, and everyone said the last place he was seen was in that basement." I felt a chill run down my spine, a cold sweat forming on the back of my neck. "Missing?" I echoed, my voice barely above a whisper. She nodded gravely, her gaze shifting to the ground. "They searched everywhere, but the boy was never found. They say his spirit lingers in that house, especially in the basement. Strange things have happened there ever since." Her words felt like a heavy weight resting on my chest, tightening with each sentence. I asked her to tell me more, desperate for answers. She recounted the tales, the whispers, the shadows, and the ominous feeling that enveloped the basement. She spoke of parents who had refused to live in the house after the boy's disappearance, claiming the atmosphere felt wrong, heavy with sorrow. As I listened, images flooded my mind. Visions of a young boy playing in the basement, laughter echoing off the walls, suddenly replaced by silence. I could almost feel the warmth of a child's presence before it was snatched away by an unseen force. The old woman pointed me towards her house. "I have some old photographs and clippings you might find interesting. They were from the local papers when it happened. If you want to know more, you're welcome to take a look." I thanked her and hurried over, my pulse quickening with anticipation and dread. As I sifted through the faded photographs and brittle newspaper articles, I felt like I was stepping back in time. One photograph caught my eye, an innocent-looking boy with tousled brown hair and a bright smile, playing in front of a now dilapidated swing set. The caption read, "Missing, Jason Thompson, age 8, last seen in the vicinity of the Johnson residence." With each clipping I read, a chilling realization began to dawn on me. The basement wasn't just a storage space. It held the echoes of a tragic past. There were articles about the search efforts, the heartbreak of a family torn apart, and the desperate pleas of neighbors who had once called the boy their own. They had combed through every inch of the neighborhood, but the basement was never properly searched. Everyone had assumed it was just an empty, dusty space. The old woman returned with a photo album, and as she handed it to me, I felt an overwhelming urge to learn everything about Jason and the mysteries of the house. The pages were filled with memories, birthdays, family gatherings, and everyday moments of a life that seemed so vibrant yet ended too soon. My heart ached for the boy who never got the chance to grow up, and the more I looked, the more I felt a connection to the space I now inhabited. In one of the later pages, I found a drawing that sent a chill down my spine. It was a crude sketch of the basement, with the words, "Don't go down there," scribbled across the top in shaky handwriting. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I realized this was Jason's own warning. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had happened to him was still very much alive. After I left the neighbor's house, I walked back to my own with the weight of the history pressing heavily on my mind. As I entered my home, I glanced at the basement door, a dark maw that seemed to beckon me into its depths. I recalled the whispers, the shadows, and the uncanny sensation of being watched. I could no longer deny that something was lurking beneath the surface, something tied to the past, intertwining with my own life. Later that night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the unease that enveloped me. I kept replaying the stories in my mind, haunted by the image of Jason and the weight of his unfinished life. I had to know more, but the idea of descending into that basement filled me with dread. Suddenly, a loud creak echoed through the house, pulling me from my thoughts. My heart raced as I turned toward the source of the sound. The basement door had swung open slightly, revealing a sliver of darkness that felt alive. "What do you want?" I whispered into the stillness, my voice trembling. The silence that followed was suffocating, but I could feel the air growing heavier around me. Would you continue living in a house with such a dark history, or would you leave immediately? I found myself pondering, the questions echoing in my mind like the whispers from below, urging me to confront the truth. The storm outside raged on, pounding against the windows and creating an almost hypnotic rhythm. I lay in bed, tossing and turning, consumed by thoughts of Jason and the dark history of my home. It was a strange feeling, a mixture of fear and determination that propelled me from my bed and down the dim hallway toward the basement door. The whispers grew louder in my mind, urging me forward as if the very walls were alive with secrets waiting to be uncovered. I took a deep breath and gripped the handle, forcing the door open. A gust of cold air rushed past me, wrapping around me like a shroud as I descended the creaky wooden stairs. The familiar musty smell hit me hard, but this time there was a new sensation, a lingering weight in the air that felt charged with energy. It was as if the basement was aware of my presence, holding its breath in anticipation. Once I reached the bottom, I glanced around, the faint light from a single bulb barely cutting through the oppressive darkness. Shadows danced along the walls, stretching and twisting as I moved deeper into the space. My heart raced as I approached the sealed-off section that had haunted my thoughts since I first laid eyes on it. The entrance was just a few feet away, covered by a heavy wooden door that looked as if it hadn't been touched in years. Rusty hinges creaked ominously as I pushed against the door, its weight resisting my efforts. Finally, with a determined shove, it gave way, revealing an area cloaked in an unsettling darkness that seemed to swallow the light whole. As I stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted. The air was cold, almost damp, and I felt a chill race down my spine. My eyes adjusted, and I took in the sight before me. The room was filled with old, cobweb-covered tools that looked like they belonged to a different time. Saws, hammers, and strange, jagged instruments that sent a shiver through me. They were arranged haphazardly, as if left in a hurry, and I couldn't shake the feeling that they hinted at something more than mere repairs or projects. The oppressive darkness seemed to pulse around me, and I took a cautious step further into the room. My foot crunched against something beneath me, and I glanced down to find a broken piece of wood. Shaking off the unsettling feeling, I forced myself to focus, scanning the walls. My heart raced as I spotted something strange. Faint symbols carved into the wood, symbols that seemed to pulse with a life of their own, a warning perhaps. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and a sense of dread washed over me. I had come to uncover the truth, but at what cost? I pressed on, fueled by an overwhelming urge to know more. In the far corner of the room, half hidden beneath a tattered blanket, I spotted an old, dusty toy box. My heart skipped a beat as I approached it, the memories of the child flooding back. I knelt down, trembling as I brushed away the dust, revealing a colorful box adorned with faded stickers of cartoon characters. I lifted the lid, and a cloud of musty air escaped, filling my lungs with a nostalgic scent that was both sweet and suffocating. Inside, I found a collection of toys, faded stuffed animals, a few broken action figures, and marbles that had long lost their shine. Each item felt like a piece of Jason's lost childhood, remnants of the joy he was robbed of. I picked up a small teddy bear, its fur matted and worn, and felt a pang of sorrow for the boy who had once held it close. But then, something caught my eye, a leather-bound diary tucked beneath the toys. I carefully pulled it out, its pages yellowed and fragile, as I opened it to the first entry. My heart raced as I read the words scrawled in a child's handwriting, filled with fear and confusion. "Mommy says to stay away from the basement," one entry read, "but I hear them calling me. I feel trapped here." I felt a chill run through me, the implications of the words settling heavily in my chest. The entries continued, each more haunting than the last, detailing Jason's growing anxiety, his feelings of being watched, and the whispers that filled the house, echoing my own experiences. Suddenly, my heart dropped as I flipped to the last page. Just as I began to process the weight of Jason's words, a loud crash echoed through the basement, shattering the stillness and sending my pulse racing. The lights flickered violently before plunging me into darkness. I fumbled in the pitch black, my hands brushing against the cold, damp walls as panic surged within me. I could hear the sound of something heavy moving in the shadows, the faint echo of footsteps that seemed to draw closer. "No, no, no," I gasped, my breath coming in quick gasps as the oppressive darkness surrounded me. With a surge of adrenaline, I turned and sprinted toward the door, my heart pounding in my ears as the whispers grew louder, swirling around me in a chaotic cacophony. I could feel something behind me, chasing me through the darkness, a cold breath on my neck that sent a jolt of terror through my veins. Just as I reached the doorway, I dared to glance back, my heart stopping at the sight that met my eyes. In the dim light of the basement, I saw a shadow, a small, fleeting figure darting across the room. It was there and gone in an instant, but the image etched itself into my mind, leaving me paralyzed with fear. In that moment, I felt the weight of Jason's fear pressing down on me, the realization that whatever had taken him was still here, lingering in the shadows, waiting for its next victim. The air grew thicker, suffocating me as I stumbled through the door, desperate to escape the nightmare that had become my reality. I slammed the door shut behind me, my heart racing as I leaned against it, gasping for breath. I could still hear the whispers, now more frantic, echoing through the space. As I stood there, the adrenaline slowly faded, replaced by a chilling sense of dread. Whatever had happened in that basement was far from over. As I pressed my back against the door, the weight of my own breath filled my lungs, a desperate attempt to quell the panic rising within me. The basement was still, save for the echoes of my racing heart. But as I took a moment to steady myself, an icy shiver raced down my spine, a warning from the deepest recesses of my instinct. Then I felt it, a breath, cold and unmistakably real, brushed against my neck, sending a cascade of goosebumps racing across my skin. I froze, the oppressive air thickening around me, wrapping me in a shroud of dread. The darkness felt alive, coiling tightly as if it had wrapped its fingers around my throat. A voice, soft yet haunting, whispered directly into my ear, a plea laden with despair. "Help me, please." I felt my heart skip a beat, the sensation of fear twisting in my gut like a coiled snake ready to strike. I had been so sure I was alone, but this presence, the one that chilled the air and made the hair on the back of my neck stand up, told a different story. It was not just the remnants of a child's spirit that lingered here. There was something else, something dark and desperate that had been waiting for me. In that moment of realization, I felt utterly powerless, as though the very walls were closing in around me, trapping me in this nightmare. The whispers grew more urgent, a chorus of voices merging into a cacophony of anguish. "Stay with us, don't leave," they echoed, wrapping around me like chains. Each plea tugged at my heart, merging fear with an inexplicable pull of sympathy. "No," I shouted into the darkness, my voice trembling. "I have to go." The sound of my own words felt like a final straw against the weight of the terror that enveloped me. With every ounce of willpower, I turned and bolted for the stairs, my legs feeling as though they were moving through molasses. I could hear the whispers rise in pitch, a frantic rush of desperation that filled the air. "Don't go. You'll regret it." They slithered around me, chilling my bones, dragging me back into the depths of the basement. I raced up the stairs, the wood creaking beneath my weight, each step feeling like a battle against an unseen force trying to pull me back down. As I reached the top of the stairs, I could almost feel the cold presence pursuing me, an unseen entity that hungered for my fear. The whispers crescendoed, urging me to turn back, to stay with them in the darkness. "Help us stay." I slammed the door shut behind me, my heart pounding like a drum in my chest. For a moment, I stood there, gasping for breath, trying to drown out the whispers that still seeped through the cracks, taunting me with their sorrow. But even as I caught my breath, the realization hit me with a heavy force. Whatever had been down there didn't just want me to stay. It wanted to keep me there, forever entwined in its misery. The rain continued to lash against the windows, a fitting backdrop to the chaos in my mind. I pressed my back against the door, my body trembling as I tried to steady my breath. The whispers faded, but the lingering sense of dread remained, filling every corner of my mind. Was it really gone? Had I escaped? Or was it merely biding its time, waiting for another opportunity to ensnare me? Shaking off the thoughts, I turned and stumbled into the dimly lit hallway, desperate to put distance between myself and the darkness below. But the sense of being watched didn't leave me. It clung to me, a persistent reminder of what lurked just beyond the threshold. I could feel the cold air still trailing behind me, the breath of the basement lingering on my skin, as though the house itself was breathing down my neck. I needed to get out. The weight of the house felt oppressive, as if it were trying to pull me back down into its depths. I sprinted to the front door, adrenaline coursing through my veins. The whispers were gone, replaced by a heavy silence that felt even more threatening. Just as I reached for the doorknob, I heard it, a soft thud behind me, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoing in the hallway. My heart raced as I turned, dread pooling in my stomach. The shadows seemed to deepen, stretching and shifting as though something was emerging from the darkness, something that had been waiting for me to make my move. "Please," a voice came from behind me, so small and childlike, yet so filled with sorrow. "Don't leave me." I turned and stared into the darkness, my heart pounding in my chest. There, in the shadows, stood a figure, a small child with wide, pleading eyes. My breath caught in my throat, and a sense of recognition washed over me. It was Jason, the boy from the stories, the one who had gone missing in this very house. But there was something wrong. The way he stood, his face twisted in despair, sent shivers down my spine. "I'm trapped. I can't leave," he whispered, his voice trembling with anguish. The realization hit me like a tidal wave. Jason was not just a victim. He was a vessel, a pawn in whatever darkness resided within these walls. He was not here to guide me to safety, but to draw me in, to share in his suffering. "Help me," he pleaded, his small frame shaking. In that moment, I felt the weight of his despair pressing down on me, mixing with my own fear. "I can't," I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. "I can't help you." And just like that, the shadowy figure flickered, wavering in the dim light. The coldness that enveloped me intensified, swirling around like a tempest as Jason's form began to dissolve into the darkness, leaving only his desperate whisper echoing in the air. "Please." I stumbled back, my heart racing, knowing I had to escape before the darkness claimed me too. With a burst of adrenaline, I turned back to the front door, grasping the handle tightly and yanking it open. The storm raged outside, But the rain felt like a cleansing balm against the terror that had unfolded in the house. As I stepped outside, the cool air hit me like a rush of freedom. I was finally away from the house, but I could still hear the faintest echoes of Jason's pleas reverberating in my mind. The whispers had followed me, lingering like a shadow, a reminder of the darkness that still dwelled within those walls. I didn't look back as I ran down the path, fueled by the urgency to escape, to leave the haunting memories behind. But even as I fled, a part of me knew that I had only just scratched the surface of the horrors that lay within that basement, horrors that would forever haunt me, drawing me back into the darkness whenever I dared to forget. The first rays of dawn cast a pale light across the hallway as I finally pried myself away from the front door, where I had been standing in a trance, unable to shake the memory of that figure in the shadows. Jason's face, etched with despair, lingered in my mind like an uninvited guest, his whispered plea echoing in my ears. "Please don't leave me." I hadn't slept. The whispers and images kept haunting me, vivid even with my eyes wide open. I'd hoped that the daylight might dilute the darkness, make it easier to breathe. But the morning only seemed to deepen the shadows that clung to the house, as if it fed off the new day's light, drawing strength from it. After pacing the hallway for what felt like hours, I made a decision. I had to lock it away. The basement, the darkness, the secrets, all of it. I would seal it behind wood and nails, burying it where it couldn't reach me anymore. Grabbing a hammer and nails, I approached the basement door, the final barrier to whatever horror lay beyond. My hands shook as I positioned the first plank, forcing myself to look away from the small gaps between the boards, where I could almost feel the basement watching me. One by one, the nails sunk into the wood, each strike reverberating through the quiet house. It felt like I was building a prison, not for the basement, but for myself, as if I were locking away a part of my own mind with each nail. When the last plank was secured, I stepped back, staring at the barricade, half expecting to hear scratching from the other side. But there was only silence, a heavy, suffocating silence. And yet, as I took a step back, a chill crept up my spine, a reminder of that presence I had felt down there, the cold hand on my shoulder, the whispers calling my name. Boarding up the door hadn't erased it. It only buried it, left it lying in wait. The house felt no different. If anything, the silence felt denser, thicker, as if the darkness was pressing up against the boards, searching for cracks to slip through. I walked away from the basement, but the sense of relief was fleeting. Even as I tried to settle back into a normal routine, I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched. Shadows seemed to lengthen at the edges of my vision, moving in ways they shouldn't, bending toward me like curious fingers. And the whispers, they hadn't stopped. I heard them in the dead of night, faint and muffled, as if calling to me from the depths of my dreams. They were softer now, less urgent, but persistent, slipping into the silence, reminding me of what lay just beyond that boarded-up door. Some nights, I could swear I heard scratching from the basement, faint but unmistakable, like something trying to claw its way back into my life. Other times, I'd wake in a cold sweat, the echo of Jason's plea ringing in my ears, his voice thick with sorrow and desperation. I'd lie there, staring at the ceiling, my heart pounding as I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, just the remnants of a bad dream. But deep down, I knew better. I began to avoid the basement door entirely, refusing to go near it as if simply acknowledging it would somehow give it power. The house felt different now, as though the walls had absorbed the fear and despair, turning the air heavy and stale. The shadows seemed to pool in corners, lingering longer than they should, flickering in ways that made my skin crawl. Even during the day, I felt a strange, oppressive presence, a reminder that the darkness was still there, waiting just beyond the thin wooden planks. Eventually, I considered leaving the house, packing up and walking away from it all. But each time I stood on the front porch, suitcase in hand, a strange pull stopped me, a whisper in my mind that seemed to anchor me to the spot. The house felt like it had claimed a piece of me, embedding itself into my very soul, as if leaving would only invite it to follow. So I stayed, haunted by memories of that night, by the faint whispers and flickering shadows, a prisoner in my own home. In the end, I could never be sure if what I had encountered was real or a figment of my own fear, a hallucination crafted from the shadows of my mind. But the uncertainty was worse, that nagging doubt gnawing at me every time I closed my eyes, wondering if, one day, the darkness would slip through the cracks and consume me whole. If you enjoyed these stories, if they sent chills down your spine and made you question what lies hidden in the dark, then I encourage you to hit that subscribe button. And don't just stop there. Share your thoughts and fears in the comments below. Have you ever encountered something strange in the dark? Maybe you felt a presence watching you from the shadows or heard whispers when no one was there. I want to hear your stories, your encounters with the unknown. Remember to keep an ear out for the whispers in the night, the creaks of the floorboards, and the shadows that dance just beyond the light. You never know what might be lurking just out of sight.